Bank laughed at old man in rags. Then a military unit came to escort him. The autumn rain had been falling steadily for 3 days, turning the busy streets of downtown Chicago into rivers of gray slush. Through the glass doors of First National Trust, the city's most prestigious bank, pedestrians hurried past with umbrellas bent against the wind. Inside, the marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and well-dressed customers conducted their business in hushed, important tones. It was 2:47 p.m. when the door chimed, and Silas Creed stepped inside. He moved slowly, deliberately, his weathered hands gripping a frayed burlap sack. His clothes, a threadbare coat held together with safety pins, pants stained with mud and time, marked him immediately as an outsider in this temple of wealth. Water dripped from his gray beard onto the pristine floor, each drop echoing in the sudden silence that followed his entrance. The security guard's hand instinctively moved toward his radio. Several customers glanced up from their transactions, their expressions shifting from curiosity to distaste. A woman in a designer suit actually stepped backward, clutching her Hermes bag tighter. Silas paid no attention to their stares. His pale blue eyes, sharp, despite the exhaustion etched in the lines around them, scanned the teller windows with quiet purpose. He approached the nearest station, where a young woman named Jessica sat behind bulletproof glass, her perfectly manicured, nails clicking against her keyboard. "Good afternoon," Silas said, his voice soft but clear. "I need to access an account." Jessica looked up, barely concealing her disgust. The smell of wet wool and unwashed clothes had reached her even through the barrier. "Sir, do you have an account with us?" "Yes." Silas reached into his coat pocket, producing a small, worn piece of paper. "The account number is there, along with the routing information." She glanced at the paper dismissively. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification, and I have to tell you that the account is classified under Department Echo protocols," Silas interrupted gently. "X-ray clearance should be sufficient for initial verification." Jessica blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" Behind Silas, a man in an expensive suit snorted with laughter. "Department Echo? What is this, a comic book?" The comment drew chuckles from other customers waiting in line. "Sir," Jessica continued, her voice taking on the patronizing tone reserved for difficult customers, "I don't know what you think this is, but this is a bank, not some government building. If you don't have proper identification—" "Echo returns with the tide," Silas said quietly, his eyes never leaving hers. "That phrase should be in your system somewhere. Please check." The laughter behind him grew louder. "Hey, buddy," called out the man in the suit. "The soup kitchen is 3 blocks down. Why don't you try there? Charlie, call security," someone else whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This guy's clearly having some kind of episode." 43 years earlier, Lieutenant Silas Creed stood at attention in a windowless room beneath the Pentagon. The men across from him wore no uniforms, no name tags, nothing to identify them except the weight of absolute authority in their voices. "What we're asking of you," one of them said, "is not service to your country, in any conventional sense. You will disappear, Lieutenant, completely. No records, no contact with family, no acknowledgement of your existence. You will become whoever we need you to be, wherever we need you to be, for as long as it takes. And if I refuse, you won't, because you understand what's at stake. The Cold War isn't fought in newspapers or on television, Lieutenant. It's fought in shadows by people who will never be thanked, never be remembered, never come home to parades." Silas had nodded once. It was the last time anyone would salute him for 20 years. Jessica was typing now, her fingers moving reluctantly across the keyboard. The phrases Silas had used were nonsensical, she was sure, but something about his calm certainty made her uncomfortable. She pulled up the account number he'd provided, expecting to find nothing. Her screen flickered. A dialog box appeared. "Classified access required, Department Echo protocols initiated." "What the hell?" she muttered under her breath. "Ma'am?" Silas leaned forward slightly. "Is there a problem?" Behind him the mockery continued. "Maybe he thinks he's James Bond." someone whispered. Look at him. Probably hasn't had a shower in weeks. Probably stole that account number from somewhere, another voice added. Jessica, just call the cops and get this over with. But Jessica was staring at her screen in growing confusion. The system was asking for clearance codes she'd never seen before, requesting verification through channels that didn't appear on any menu she knew. She looked up at Silas, who waited with the infinite patience of a man who had spent decades learning how to be invisible. I need to get my manager, she said finally. Of course, Silas replied. But please remember, time is often more valuable than we realize. 28 years earlier, Silas had been living as a dock worker in Hamburg for 16 months, his German flawless, his cover story memorized down to the smallest detail. The man he was tracking, a Soviet agent selling NATO submarine routes, had finally made contact. They met in a warehouse that reeked of fish and diesel fuel. Silas played his part perfectly, the desperate American willing to sell out his country for money. The Soviet handed him an envelope full of cash, never suspecting that every bill had been traced, every serial number recorded. 3 days later, the entire network was rolled up, 17 arrests across 5 countries. The Soviets spent the rest of the Cold War in a CIA safehouse, trading secrets for cigarettes and hot meals. Silas had already moved on to his next identity, his next mission, his next death to who he used. To be James Morrison, the bank manager, appeared from his office with the measured stride of a man accustomed to handling problems efficiently. He was 45, impeccably dressed, and had built his career on the principle that certain types of people simply didn't belong in his bank. Sir, he said, approaching Silas with barely concealed irritation. I understand you're having some difficulty with our teller. Perhaps you could explain to me exactly what it is you think you're doing here. Silas turned slowly, and for just a moment, Morrison caught something in those pale blue eyes, a hardness that seemed inconsistent with the ragged appearance, a depth that spoke of things seen and done in places most people couldn't imagine. I'm attempting to access my account, Mr. Morrison, Silas said, reading the man's name tag. Your teller is having difficulty with the clearance protocols. Clearance protocols? Morrison's voice rose slightly. Sir, this is First National Trust, not the Pentagon. We don't have clearance protocols. What we have are standard banking procedures which require proper identification and— The account was established in 1987, Silas interrupted. Initial deposit was $847,000, with quarterly additions authorized through Defense Intelligence Agency appropriations. The account holder was listed as deceased in 1994, but the dormancy clause was set for 30 years, not 10. Morrison's mouth had fallen open slightly. The specificity of the information delivered in that same calm tone was unsettling. Around them, the laughter had died down as other customers strained to hear what was being said. Sir, even if such an account existed, which I'm not saying it does, we would need ironclad verification before. Ghostwriter 6, Silas said quietly. Authorization code Tango Delta 7799er. Cross-reference with Operation Distant Thunder November, 1987 through March 1988. Morrison stared at him. The codes meant nothing to him, but something about the way Silas delivered them, with the precision of a man reciting his own social security number, made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. 15 years earlier, Silas lived in a cardboard box beneath an overpass in Detroit. It wasn't cover this time. It was genuine. The mission had gone wrong in ways that still woke him at night. 3 good agents dead, a terrorist network still operational, and Silas burned so badly that going home meant signing death warrants for everyone he'd ever cared about. So he became what his cover had always claimed, a homeless veteran, forgotten by the country he'd served. He ate from dumpsters, slept in doorways, and watched the city's underbelly with eyes that missed nothing. For 7 years, he fed information to handlers who never knew his real name, helped prevent attacks that would never make the news, saved lives that would never know they'd been in danger. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent his career pretending to be someone else. Now, pretending to be no one at all, he was finally becoming who he really was. "Mr. Morrison," Jessica called from her station, her voice tight with nervousness. "Could you come here, please?" Morrison excused himself and walked to the teller window where Jessica was pointing at her screen with a shaking finger. "The system accepted his codes," she whispered. "All of them. And sir, you need to see what came up." Morrison leaned over to look at the screen and his face went white. The account was real. More than real. It was tagged with classifications he'd never seen, connected to government agencies that most people assumed were fictional. The balance was substantial, but more importantly, the account was flagged with alerts that were now cascading through the system like digital fireworks. "What? What did you do?" he asked Jessica. "Nothing. I just entered what he told me, and the system started going crazy. Sir, look at this. It's generating some kind of automatic alert. To who, I don't know, but a sound from outside made everyone in the bank freeze. It was low and rumbling, growing steadily louder. Through the glass doors, they could see black SUVs pulling up to the curb, followed by vehicles that were clearly military. The mockery stopped completely now. Customers pressed against the windows trying to see what was happening. A perimeter was being established around the bank, soldiers in full tactical gear taking positions with the efficiency of men who had done this many times before. "Oh my God," someone whispered. "What's happening?" Silas hadn't moved from his position at the counter. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on some middle distance, waiting with the patience of a man who had spent a lifetime learning that everything came to those who knew how to wait. "Sir?" Morrison approached him again, his voice now respectful, tinged with fear. "Sir, I think maybe we should—" The bank's doors opened with a sharp chime, and a man in a military uniform strode inside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His uniform was immaculate, his chest decorated with ribbons that spoke of service in places most civilians couldn't pronounce. He scanned the room once, his gaze settling immediately on Silas, and then he did something that made every person in that bank question everything they thought they knew about the world. He saluted. Not the casual salute of military courtesy, but the sharp, precise salute of deep respect. His heels came together with a crack that echoed through the marble-floored space. "Colonel Creed," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "Sir, it's an honor." 3 years earlier, the handler found Silas in the shelter, where he'd been staying for the past month. The man looked like a social worker, complete with clipboard and tired eyes, but Silas knew better. They always found him eventually. "It's time to come in from the cold," the handler said quietly. "The world's changed. The threats have changed. We need you for something different now." "I've been out too long," Silas replied. "I'm not the man you remember." "No," the handler agreed. "You're better. You've seen things from the bottom up that most of our analysts can only theorize about. You understand this country. Really understand it in ways that brass and politicians never will. What's the mission? To come home, to let us acknowledge what you've done, to help us understand what we've become." Silas turned slowly to face the officer. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. His posture straightened slightly, and something in his expression shifted from the weary patience of a homeless man to the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command. "Major," he said, his voice carrying a different quality now. "Status report." "All secure, sir. Perimeter established, area cleared. We're ready for extraction whenever you are." The bank had become completely silent except for the soft hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of radios from outside. Customers stood frozen, their minds struggling to process what they were witnessing. The man they had been mocking moments before, the homeless vagrant they had dismissed as delusional, was being treated with the kind of respect typically reserved for visiting heads of state. Morrison found his voice first. I don't understand. Who is he?" The major glanced at the bank manager with the cool assessment of a professional soldier. "Colonel Silas Creed, sir. United States Army retired. Formerly attached to Defense Intelligence Agency Special Activities Division." He paused, as if deciding how much to reveal. "The colonel has been operating under deep cover for the past 27 years. His service record is classified, but I can tell you that operations he's been involved in have prevented more threats to American security than most people could imagine. But he's—" Morrison gestured helplessly at Silas's appearance. "Part of his cover, sir. The colonel has lived as a homeless veteran for the past several years while monitoring potential security threats in major urban areas. His condition has been entirely voluntary and in service to his country." Jessica, still at her teller window, spoke up in a small voice. "The account, it's real?" "Yes, ma'am. The account contains funds and documentation related to the colonel's service, funds that were held in trust while he was unable to access them due to operational security requirements." Silas moved to the counter and placed both hands on the marble surface. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had given orders that saved lives and taken others. "Mr. Morrison," he said, "I believe my account is ready for access now." Morrison nodded frantically, then rushed to his computer terminal. His hands shook as he typed, authorizing access levels he'd never used before. The account opened like a flower blooming and fast forward, revealing not just substantial funds but documents, commendations, and records of service that painted a picture of a life lived entirely in shadows. "Jesus," Morrison whispered, reading the citations that scrolled across his screen. "Bronze Star, Silver Star, Distinguished Service Cross. How many times were you decorated?" "Decorations weren't the point," Silas replied. "Service was. 1 year earlier, Silas sat in a government office that officially didn't exist across from men whose names weren't in any phone book. The debriefing had taken 6 months, 27 years of accumulated intelligence, observations, and insights downloaded into reports that would shape policy for decades. "The homeless crisis isn't just a social issue," he'd told them. "It's a security vulnerability. These people are invisible, which makes them perfect for gathering intelligence, both for us and against us. The man sleeping in the doorway of a federal building sees more than the guards inside ever will." "And the terrorist activities you uncovered? 3 separate cells operating out of major cities, using homeless communities as cover. They were planning coordinated attacks on infrastructure targets. The beauty of it was that nobody looks at homeless people long enough to notice patterns. How did you—" "I became one of them. Really became one of them. Not just playing a part, but living the life. Understanding their world from the inside." He'd paused, looking out the window at a city that had no idea how often it had been saved. "You can't protect something you don't understand." The woman who had stepped away from Silas earlier, clutching her designer bag, now approached hesitantly. Her face was flushed with shame, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I assumed." Silas turned to her with the same patient expression he'd worn throughout the entire encounter. "Ma'am, you had no reason to assume otherwise. I was exactly what I appeared to be, a homeless man in need. That you were uncomfortable doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you human. But you were serving our country, and I was serving our country by being exactly what you saw. Don't apologize for seeing clearly." The man in the expensive suit who had made jokes earlier was standing by the windows, staring out at the military vehicles. His face had gone through several colors, finally settling on a pale green that suggested he might be sick. "I can't believe what I said," he muttered to himself. "I made jokes about, oh God, I'm such an ass." Silas heard him and walked over. "Son," he said gently, "you made jokes about a homeless man. You weren't making jokes about a soldier because you didn't know. I was one. There's a difference. But still nothing. The man you mocked was real too. For years I really was that homeless veteran. I ate from garbage cans, I slept in the cold, I was ignored and dismissed and treated exactly the way you treated me today. The only difference is that I chose it." He paused, looking out at the city beyond the glass. "But thousands of other veterans didn't choose it. They're out there right now, and they deserve the same respect you're showing me, even without the uniform to back it up." The major approached. "Sir, we're ready when you are." Silas nodded, then turned back to the crowd of bank employees and customers who were watching him with expressions ranging from awe to confusion to shame. "I want you all to remember something," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the lobby. "Service isn't about recognition. It isn't about parades or medals or people knowing your name. Real service happens in the shadows, performed by people you'll never hear about, protecting things you'll never know were threatened." He gestured toward the windows where soldiers stood at attention. "Those men out there, they serve openly, with honor and recognition, but there are others serving too. The teacher who stays late to help a struggling student, the nurse who holds the hand of a dying patient, the man who gives his sandwich to someone hungrier than he is." His eyes swept the room. Heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear rags. Sometimes they're invisible. Sometimes they're standing right next to you, and you never know. Jessica spoke up from behind her counter. "Colonel Creed? The account? Is there anything specific you need to do with it?" Silas considered for a moment. "Transfer half of it to the homeless shelter on 5th Street. They'll know what to do with it." He turned to Morrison. "The other half can stay active. I suspect I'll be back to check on things from time to time." "Of course, sir. Anything you need." Silas picked up his burlap sack, which, everyone now realized, probably contained things that were more important than any of them had imagined, and walked toward the door where the major waited. As he reached the threshold, he turned back one final time. "Ma'am," he said to the woman with the designer bag, "that shelter I mentioned, they can always use volunteers, if you're ever looking for a way to serve." She nodded, tears now flowing freely. "I will. I promise I will. And sir," he addressed the man in the expensive suit, "they also need donations, not just money, time, conversation, respect. Remember that next time you see someone who looks like I did today." The man nodded vigorously. "Yes, sir, I will. I promise." Silas stepped out into the gray afternoon where soldiers snapped to attention as he passed. The crowd of bank customers pressed against the windows watching as this man they had dismissed and mocked was escorted to a waiting vehicle with full military honors. As the convoy pulled away from the curb, Morrison found himself still staring at the computer screen showing Colonel Creed's account. The service record continued scrolling, citation after citation, mission after mission, a lifetime of service performed in absolute secrecy. "Sir?" Jessica's voice broke his concentration. "What do we do now?" Morrison looked around the bank, at customers who were still processing what they'd witnessed, at employees who were seeing their workplace differently, at a world that had just revealed itself to be far more complex than any of them had imagined. "We remember," he said finally. "We remember that we don't always know who we're talking to. We remember that service comes in many forms, and we remember that heroes don't always announce themselves." Outside, the rain continued to fall on the busy streets of Chicago, where people hurried past each other with umbrellas bent against the wind. In doorways and under bridges, figures huddled against the cold, some of them veterans, some of them casualties of circumstance, some of them perhaps protectors whose stories would never be told. In the distance, the convoy carrying Colonel Silas Creed disappeared into traffic, taking with it a man who had spent his life serving in the shadows and who would, in all likelihood, return to those shadows again. Because that's what real heroes do. They serve without applause, protect without recognition, and sacrifice without expectation of reward. The bank returned to its normal rhythm, but something had changed. In the way customers looked at each other, in the way employees spoke to those who seemed different, in the understanding that every person who walked through those doors carried stories that were deeper and more complex than appearances might suggest. And somewhere in the city, in shelters and soup kitchens and on street corners, The forgotten and dismissed continued their quiet work of simply surviving. Some of them carrying secrets, some of them carrying service records, all of them carrying the dignity that comes with being human in a world that doesn't always remember to look closely enough to see it. The tide had returned, and Echo had finally come home.